Hello and welcome to your video on absolutes. What are absolutes? I'm going to actually give you a couple of examples just to begin with so you can see the difference between absolutes and participles and appositives. She returned to her bench, her face showing all the unhappiness that had suddenly overtaken her. You'll notice that the part that is underlined is the absolute. The boy watched, his eyes bulging in the dark. About the bones, ants were ebbing away, their pincers full of meat. His hands raw, he reached a flat place at the top. And finally, Miss Hearn, her face burning, hardly listened to these words. So hopefully you're seeing the similarities between all of these, but let me give you a little bit more explanation now that you know what they look like. Absolutes move from a description of the whole person or thing to just one part or aspect of it. So you notice in each of those examples, you moved in from a general description to its face, her hands, his pockets, their breath. And absolutes always contain a subject, and then usually a participle, sometimes an adjective. Its face tightened, her hands flexing, his pockets bulging, their breath held. So you've got that subject, the noun, and then you've got a participle. Now, of course, just like all the other things that we've been studying, they cannot stand by themselves. They cannot make their own sentences. They are not ICs. So they have to be attached to an IC. And they look a little like ICs that have lost a helping verb. So sometimes they're confused with ICs, and we'll go over that in just a little bit. Its face was tightened would be an IC, but you'll notice that for it to be an absolute, we have to take out the was. Her hands were flexing, but we don't have the were. His pockets were bulging. Those would all be ICs, but when we take out those helping verbs, was, were, and were, we get absolutes. Some more things about absolutes you need to know. If you've noticed, they often start with a possessive pronoun, like my, his, her, its, our, their. Because when you use a possessive pronoun, you're zooming in to one part of the thing. And they always go in a comma ghetto, without fail. You cannot have an absolute without putting it in a comma ghetto. They're also much more common in fiction writing. Now, we are going to use them in argumentative writing, but it will be a little bit more tricky, and that's why we've waited until this long in the semester to talk about absolutes. It will feel like you've zoomed in on one part of the subject. That's kind of how an absolute works. And just like participles, just like appositives, you may always put two absolutes side by side without a conjunction. Now, if you have trouble writing absolutes, there is an easy way to help yourself out. First of all, just compose a second sentence with a helping verb, was, were, am, whatever, and then delete that verb. It's as simple as that. So, if we have the first sentence, Dimmesdale confesses his sin, and we would like to add an absolute, we'll just write another sentence with one of those verbs. His hands are, or we could say were, his hands are clutching his chest. So when you combine them, you just take out the R. Dimmesdale, his hands clutching his chest, confesses his sin. Now, a word of warning. You've noticed that you can write a second sentence to start writing your absolute. It's very easy to write an IC when you intend to write an absolute. Always ask yourself if you've accidentally written IC, comma IC. You know that you're not allowed to do that. That's called a comma splice. So to make sure that you aren't doing that, make sure you take out those helping verbs. The incorrect way would be Dimmesdale confesses his sin, his hands are or were clutching his chest. The correct way would be Dimmesdale confesses his sin, his hands clutching his chest. Make sure that you've taken out that extra verb. It would also be equally incorrect to say his hands clutched his chest. It has to be clutching. It has to be a participle. So, how do we use them academically if they're mostly in fiction? There's a couple of ways that I suggest that we can use this in our argumentative writing. The first is that if you are writing a rhetorical analysis of narrative text, and this is really only for AP language, then if there's a clear plot, for instance, lit circle books, then you can use absolutes. His deeper logical brain telling him that 2 plus 2 equals 4, comma, Winston nonetheless convinces himself that 2 plus 2 equals 5. The first part is the absolute. His deeper logical brain is the part we're zooming in on Winston, and then we've got the participle, telling him. And then the IC, of course, is the second part. You can also use absolutes if you are doing introduction to argumentative essays and you're telling a story about yourself. So you could say something like, last year I had my first painful introduction to betrayal, comma, my entire understanding of friendship changing in a week's time. So we've taken a noun, my entire understanding of friendship, and then the participle, changing. You will notice that absolutes are a little bit like an appositive and a participle, getting married and having a baby. They kind of go together like that. You can also use absolute if you are making references to history or current events. History and current events really are just stories. They are narrative. They're just true narrative. The congressman, comma, recent abysmal poll numbers fresh on their minds, agreed to a swift resolution. So you've got recent abysmal poll numbers, that's a noun, fresh on their minds. Now this is not a participle. This is, I think you would say it's an adjective, but it is an absolute because you would put in the word were fresh on their minds if you wanted to use a whole IC, but we're taking out that were. So now that we've given you a basic explanation of absolutes, I'm going to take you through some unscrambling. You must write out the complete sentence every time. Make sure that you do that. So we've got these pieces, and we want to know how are we going to put them in order. So I'm just going to do this for you. I've kind of rearranged them. Unscrambled, we get, then the rope tightened mercilessly while Buck struggled in fury, his tongue lolling out of his mouth and his great chest panting. The second part, after the comma, those are two absolutes combined with a conjunction. And the first part is just your IC-DC with the while. Now it's time for you to take the quiz. I hope that you're ready, and I'll see you in class.